All right, let's dive right in. We are going to unpack a prophecy that's about 2,500 years old from the book of Daniel, and some believe it predicted the exact arrival and even the death of the Messiah. It's an incredibly detailed roadmap of history, but you know what? It's all built to answer one single, central, and very perplexing question.
And that question is this: if the Messiah was supposed to bring in a glorious kingdom, why on earth was he killed before it ever showed up? Well, the prophecy of the 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9 claims to have the answer. And believe me, it is a stunningly detailed one.
So our story doesn't start with some grand, flashy vision. It actually starts with an old man praying. The prophet Daniel. He's been in exile in Babylon for nearly his entire life. He's at the end of a very long road, and his mind is laser-focused on one specific number. 70. 70 years. Daniel had been reading the scrolls from the prophet Jeremiah, and he suddenly has this aha moment. He realizes that the 70-year punishment God had decreed for Israel, their captivity in Babylon, was just about over. The time was up. He sees it right there, plain as day in the text. The clock on the exile is running out. And this isn't just some academic exercise for him. This is deeply personal. This is about his people, his beloved city, and the promises of God. So what does he do? He gets on his knees and prays. And his prayer is incredibly powerful. He doesn't just say, hey, can we go home now? No. He confesses his nation's sins, he acknowledges that God's judgment was totally righteous, and then he pleads, based on God's mercy, for the restoration of Jerusalem. He's basically asking for God's kingdom promises to finally be fulfilled. And get this, while Daniel is still praying, the angel Gabriel shows up with an answer. But it is not the answer he was expecting at all. God's response is essentially, Daniel, you're focused on these 70 years of exile, but the problem is way bigger than that, and it needs a much, much longer timeline to fix. So Daniel prays about 70 years of punishment, and God responds with a completely new timeline, 490 years. Wow, this just reframes the entire problem, right? The focus shifts from a temporary exile to the entire sweep of redemptive history. Now the text says 70 weeks. The original Hebrew word here, shavuim, it just means sevens. And in this kind of prophetic context, it's understood to mean 70 units of 7 years. So you do the math. 70 times 7 gives us 490 years. And notice who this timeline is for. It's decreed specifically for your people, Israel, and your holy city, Jerusalem. So this is the crucial point, this massive pivot. Daniel's looking backward at the end of a 70-year punishment, and God completely redirects his focus forward, revealing this incredible 490-year roadmap that will ultimately deal with sin once and for all and bring in everlasting righteousness. Okay, so let's get into the timeline itself, because this is where it starts to get really interesting. The prophecy actually begins counting down from a very specific, verifiable event in history, leading directly to the arrival of the Messiah. The prophetic clock starts ticking with a decree from a Persian king, Artaxerxes, back in 445 BC to rebuild Jerusalem. As you can see, the first 49 years are set aside for rebuilding the city. Then, another 434 years go by, bringing us to a grand total of 483 years. And what happens right at the end of that period? The Messiah arrives. But what happens next is the shocking twist nobody saw coming. And here it is, the absolute core of the puzzle. The prophecy says the Messiah will be cut off. Now that's a Hebrew term for a violent death, like being executed. And not only that, but he will have nothing. For the people hearing this back then, this was a revolutionary, almost unthinkable idea. They were expecting a conquering king. Instead, this prophecy predicts he gets killed and doesn't receive his kingdom. It is a stunning twist, foretold centuries in advance. So just look at this sequence. It's wild. The Messiah shows up precisely when the timeline says he will. But instead of being crowned king, he's killed. The kingdom doesn't happen. And then, to top it all off, the prophecy says the city and the temple will be destroyed again, which, as we know from history, happened in AD 70. This is just not how anyone expected the story to go. So if 483 years have passed, what about the final 7 years? This is where we get to a really critical concept. The idea that this prophetic clock doesn't just run continuously. It actually pauses. So The idea is that after the Messiah is cut off, the prophetic clock that's ticking down for Israel just stops. There's a gap, an interval of time, before that final 7-year period begins. The timeline isn't one continuous block of 490 years. And that gap? Well, that's where we are right now. So why the pause? What happened? Well, the theological reason is that Israel as a nation rejected her prophesied king. Jesus himself even talked about the kingdom being taken from that generation and Jerusalem being left desolate. So the offer of this Davidic kingdom, it's not canceled for good, but it is postponed. This interval, this prophetic gap that we are all currently living in, is what theologians call the church age. And according to this view, this whole period was a mystery that wasn't fully revealed back in the Old Testament. Daniel saw the first 69 weeks and he saw the final 70th week, but he didn't see this long pause in between. So what happens when that prophetic clock finally starts ticking again and that final 70th week begins? Well, the prophecy gives us a very detailed and frankly, a very sobering preview of those last 7 years. And he will make a firm covenant. Now, hold on. Based on the grammar and the context, this he isn't the Messiah who was cut off. It's referring to the coming prince who was mentioned in the previous verse, a future world ruler who's often identified as the Antichrist. So this final 7-year period kicks off with this coming prince making a treaty or a covenant. But right in the middle of it, 3.5 years in, he breaks it. He puts a stop to the temple sacrifices and sets up what the Bible calls the abomination of desolation. It's basically a profound act of sacrilege in a holy place. And critically, Jesus himself in the New Testament referred to this as a future event, confirming that this final week was definitely not fulfilled back in his time. So here it is, the entire roadmap, all laid out. The first 483 years are fulfilled in the past. We are now living in the ongoing prophetic gap, the church age, and that final intense 7 years, the 70th week, is still in the future. It's really amazing when you step back and think about it. It all started with one man, Daniel, praying about the end of a simple 70-year exile. And in response, God gave him the blueprint for the next 2.5 millennia, explaining not only why the Messiah had to be cut off, but also how his kingdom would ultimately one day be established. And that brings us right to our final question. This prophecy provides a framework for understanding the past and looking toward the future. So if the first 483 years unfolded exactly as predicted, what does it mean for us that the clock for that final, intense 7-year period is still ticking, just waiting to restart?